Very much, Joe. Good morning, everyone, or evening if you're in Australia. So thanks for starting your Wednesday or finishing it if you're in Australia. So yeah, my name's Ian. The company I work with, Creative Bridge, as Joe just said, we're a specialist housing communications company. So pretty much all of our work is with registered housing providers or their partners in some kind of way. My background is very much as a housing practitioner, so former housing officer, housing manager, director, board member, and so on. So I have to say, I was really delighted to just stumble across really or discover the Housing Complaints Forum on LinkedIn a few weeks back. Partly because it's something, as we'll be talking about in a minute, I've been working on, but more than that, because I just thought, well, I'm glad it's not just me who thinks that, we really need to be doing better on this, as we'll come and talk about in a minute. Apologies for the slightly late start. We've had a few Zoom gremlins, so Ellie's going to try and drive the slides while I'm talking in a minute. Actually, why don't we start the slides now, Ellie, if you're ready to share them. Everyone see a title slide there? Yeah, great. Some nods. Okay. So yeah, after having discovered the forum, Joe kindly asked me to speak at this and in particular share the outcomes from this project I've been involved in for the last year or so actually, which we called the Complaints Lab for Laboratory. So hopefully that gives you some indication straight away of the kind of nature of that project. It was a collaborative project, and I'll tell you who's involved in a moment, but very much just about, as a laboratory would suggest, experimenting, trying some different things to see if we can do better in terms of how we handle customer complaints. And when I came to write the report, which will say to you all after this session, it pretty much came out. I think there are probably 20 key things in the report that we're suggesting will probably help, or together they will help. I won't go through all 20. You can read them for yourself, but I'll try and give you a flavor of them as we go through. My details are on that slide, and obviously we'll share the slides as well. So if anybody wants to get in touch to follow up anything, then please do that as well. Just go on to the next slide then, Ellie. So by way of summary, I just want to start on the point I've already hinted at, really, is I think just to confront this issue, which is my view, be interested to hear what others think. I think as an industry or as a sector, housing, social housing in particular, we definitely have a problem around this. I mean, I've been in housing for close on 40 years. Gives me no pleasure at all to see and think that we're actually going backwards in terms of how well we're handling complaints. So something clearly is not right there, I think. So we'll touch on that. I'll explain. I've called it Complaints Lab 1 there, partly because we're about to hopefully launch a second round of this project, but I'll tell you about what we did in the first stage of the Complaints Lab over the last 9 months or so. And just to jump straight to really, I think what is the central theme of that project, it's all about bringing a much more human approach to complaints. As I think from the regulations through to the Housing Ombudsman's Complaints Code through to every organisation's policy and strategy. I don't think there's any shortage of good sense written down about what organisations should be doing. It's actually the delivery of that by the people involved. So being human, I'll summarise, as I said, the 20 things to do differently and better. Talk briefly about where we're going for the project in its next stage, and then we'll have some time for some questions and reactions and comments. I mean, if you feel I've got any of this wrong, or we've got any of this wrong from this project, or we've missed something, then great, please shout. Obviously, you have your own experiences as well, so hopefully we'll be able to cover all of that. And there's a little thumbnail of the report that we'll send you. Presumably, we've got everybody's email addresses, Joe, have we? So we can email it or.
People have had to register prior to the workshop, so we've got everyone's email addresses, and afterwards I will send them the link to the recording and also anything that you want to send through to them, Ian.
Yeah, well, principally it'll be that report. That's fine. Okay. Before I go on, is there anything else that anybody's come along this morning thinking actually they really would like to touch on? Because I'm sure it probably came up during our project. Any other front of mind issues or things that if anyone else was at the summit earlier in the week that came up that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, if there's anything else that you want to cover today, then stick it in the chat there and we will raise that when you finish, Ian. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay. So let's go back to this point about whether or not housing has a problem. I think it does. So if we go to our next slide, Millie. So I expect some of you have seen this publication from Housemark, which was the summary and analysis of last year's tenant satisfaction measures. So overall, satisfaction among social housing customers has dropped quite sharply since before pre-pandemic days, and that was certainly been mentioned at the summit in a number of so from an average of about 185%, I mean, we're now below 70%. Once again, generalizing as a sector, and that's got to be a concern. But I think the real outlier in all of those numbers, and those of you who are from housing providers, I'm sure will know your own numbers. The median level of satisfaction for how much customers are satisfied with how complaints are handled is 33.8%. Now, I know there's some issues around the methodology of that question, and a number of people have said we've actually had more people saying they're dissatisfied with complaints than actually made complaints. But setting aside that, I think once again that number has to be a cause for concern, because in a commercial setting, clearly an organisation that was only securing that level of satisfaction when something goes wrong would its days would probably be numbered. And although it's disappointing, I'll be honest, it didn't come as a great surprise to me. I spend a lot of my time helping organizations with their writing skills, and as a result I get to see quite a lot of real correspondence with customers of all sorts, but particularly people tend to share and send and want to concentrate on how they write when something goes wrong, particularly around complaints. And I won't mince my words. I mean, a lot of what I've seen over the last 4 or 5 years has been absolutely dreadful. And the real tragedy of that, I think, is not only that it's probably not helping the customers who are in a difficult position sometimes, but really just not, organizations are not doing themselves justice. Even the best organizations I work with, some of their correspondence and contact with customers has been really just clearly not up to scratch. So that headline number, to be honest, isn't a great surprise to me, but I think it should certainly be a concern for all of us. Now, I see a chat thing popped up there, but I'm not seeing what it says. Let me just see if I can.
Yeah, don't worry too much about the chat.
Right,
I
you
will
chat if
have a
something
look at
comes
that.
up. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, just before we go any further, I mean, I'd be interested in immediate reaction. Am I being unfair there, or too blunt in that assessment? I mean, what do people think? There's a few. Anybody take a contrary view, or how does it feel for any of you who are facing similar numbers? Any immediate reactions to that idea about whether we do actually have a problem here?
Well, Claire's actually said in the chat, I also wonder if some of the people who are dissatisfied and haven't complained are making a comment about access and or confidence. And I think I'm inclined to agree with you there,
Yeah.
Claire. Actually, because the tenant satisfaction measures are all around perception, aren't they? Tenant perception. And I think it might not be necessarily that somebody's made a complaint. It just might be their perception of the complaints procedure. And we know that there's 96%, I think, isn't it, of unhappy customers won't complain. Well, they're the silent voices, aren't they? And they will tell you in the tenant satisfaction measures what their perception is. They're not making a complaint, because why make a complaint when nothing will change? I think that's what I think. Anybody else got an opinion on that? Anyone else got a view?
You made an excellent point in your presentation yesterday, Claire, which is that not only that most people don't complain, which we have to remind ourselves about, but actually people, as customers, we quite often perceive that there's risks attached to complaining. So people are disincentivized or reluctant to complain because they feel there's going to be some downside to it. Oh, I see a hand has gone up there.
Hannah, yes, you've got your hand up, Hannah.
I have, yeah. And just to say, I've got my camera turned off while you're talking because I'm looking at the screen this way, and I hate that side profile. But, the thing that I wonder about is there is that whole point of there will be a cohort of people who have that perception, who think, what's the point? The other group that I think sometimes is that they've had a bad experience previously, and where that's really challenging is that they've had a bad experience. You can make all of the changes in the world, but if that's their perception, and so they think, well, what's the point? That you never really have the opportunity to change that and influence that. And I do sometimes think that that's something that you really get within social housing, particularly if you think about the prevalence of some of the commentary on social media where, somebody might be saying, what's the point? Because, my housing officer never rang me back. If you had a bad experience and then you see that, you're not going to be incentivized. And it's whether or not you feel like you've got the fight sometimes to kind of think, actually, I'm going to take this and see it all the way through it. That the housing ombudsman and complaints processes are great, but it's actually quite a big endeavour for the individual that has to go through that.
Yeah, absolutely. Ian, what's your response to that?
I completely agree. We'll touch on the housing ombudsman's role in this, which I think is significant. And without breaching any confidences, I had a slightly frustrating conversation with the housing ombudsman team yesterday, actually, which didn't fill me with great hope. And I think there is an issue there. What organisation are you from then, Hannah?
So I work for Solihull Council, but I've worked for quite a few large RPs as well. So I think that's probably where I've had more of my experience, because we've got an Almo here at Solihull Council. So I'm a step back really from some of the customer satisfaction data.
Okay. Anyway, sorry, go on, Jim.
Just whilst we're on the subject, Catherine's put into the chat here, whilst the customer may not have made a provider what a provider classes as a formal complaint, the customer may feel that by expressing an opinion on a service failure or dissatisfaction, that they've indeed made a complaint, irrespective of whether we as providers choose to class it as a formal complaint. So there may be that cohort who think they've made a complaint when in actual fact they haven't made a complaint. Hannah, you've got your hand up again.
Yeah, the other group that I think that you can include within that, and I think back to sort of my time in antisocial behaviour, the number of requests that we got in our team for, say, a without notice injunction for somebody that perhaps come into reception and they'd perceived to have been aggressive. And it was quite difficult sometimes because to sit down and say, well, actually, they came in and they said that, the service that they'd received was effing S. And actually, if we look at it, they're right. Maybe that wasn't the best language, but they weren't swearing at you. They weren't being aggressive towards you. They were extremely dissatisfied. And I think there's also those types of individuals that they definitely get the worst response because they're then labelled as perpetrators, and all of a sudden then we're saying joint visits only, and all these barriers to service get put in place.
And in fact, I saw a photo of Naomi Sweeting at Liverpool yesterday, and she'd got a quote behind her, and it's a quote that chimes with me because I use it quite often. And it said, I can't remember the full quote, but the basis of it is that behind every behaviour there is a need, and you need to establish what that need is. Overlook the behaviour for a minute and try and establish what the need is, because once you get to the root. So anyway, we'll let you get on, Ian, because we could talk all day, couldn't we?
Once again, proving that, I think there's clearly an issue here that needs addressing. And I realise I slightly skimmed over the actual title of this presentation and indeed of the report, which is all about putting people before processes. I think there's so much process in this area of business that it actually gets in the way, just as Hannah was saying, of some of those human things that we actually do need to be addressed. So anyway, let's skip on to our next slide. Excuse me, Ellie. Right, there we go. So the complaints lab, as we called it, we, having had this idea that gosh, we should really try and do something about this, we reached out to some of our contacts and clients, and in the end 5 housing organisations, the ones that you can see there, so Homes Plus and WHG and Trent and Dove broadly in the Midlands, and then RHP in London and Teen Housing in Devon. So a bit of a spread across the country. So 5 housing associations who said, yeah, we'd like to work together to take a fresh look at how we do complaints. So the 3 sort of tick boxes, those were our mantra really about what we were trying to do. There was a determination to actually do something differently, to try a new approach to complaints. In so doing, actually make a tangible difference to the service that organisations receive, so that it wasn't effing S, hopefully, that it was actually something like that. And from that, trying to attack that central number, which we just saw a minute ago, is at the end, if people do make a complaint if something's gone wrong, then at the end of it, they feel actually more satisfied with the way they've been handled. Whether or not people get everything they've asked for or want, different point, but in terms of how how people feel about it. There's some slightly wordy slides amongst these, but once again, you'll be able to look at them more at your leisure. So if we go on to the next slide, this is just a very brief summary of what we actually did in the project. So we started off with a baseline survey just to look across all the 5 organisations, as I said, what their policies were, what their current performance was, and so on. We asked all of the organisations to send us, I think it was up to 20 recent examples of real complaints responses, all anonymised, of course, both from the customer and the staff point of view, just so we could have a look at the reality of what people were actually receiving by way of response. And then we gave some feedback on that. We then ran 2 online customer sessions, and I think without exception, all the customers who took part were people who had made a complaint within a reasonable time. So they were people who brought their own experience to those. And then across the whole year of the project, we ran 4 sessions, involving the 5 organisations, each of whom then identified at least one thing, in most cases more than one, that they would actually do differently and test and trial in real time and report back. And once again, the details of those things are in the report. And then towards the back end of the project, having obviously got to know the organisations fairly well, seeing what their issues were, thinking about what they were trying, we put together a half-day, very tailored training session for each of the organisations. Some of them wanted to sort of delve more into the psychology of what's actually going on in people's minds when they make a complaint. Others, perhaps unsurprisingly, given the way into this, were very keen to look again at how they actually write and communicate to customers. And throughout, we produced a variety of just best practice bulletins, and then produced the report, which we'll send you, and indeed it's gone off to the Housing Ombudsman. So that's a very brief summary of the actual mechanics of the project, and as I said, spread out over sort of 9 to 12 months or so by the time we finished. Just as an aside, if we go on to our next slide, I mean, I think it was interesting that all of that was taking place rather while the stuff around the sub postmasters scandal was really beginning to kick off. I know it's obviously been around for an issue for many years, but in terms of the really coming to attention through the TV program and then the government's response and inquiry. And I think, gosh, if you needed a case study in how not to handle a problem or a complaint, it would be that. And indeed, without exaggerating it, the really difficult knock-on effects that can emerge if you don't get this stuff right, if you don't acknowledge there's a problem and you put up the defences and you deal with it badly, it can have really catastrophic, even fatal consequences. So it was interesting that all that was going on while we were working together. A couple more slightly texty slides. You don't have to read them, but I'll give you the gist of them if we carry on. So when we did that baseline study, I mean, on paper, it looked pretty good, actually. All of the organisations sent us their policies. They'd all been relatively recently updated. All of the organisations were saying the right things, saying we welcome complaints. If you're not happy, we want to hear about it. The way complaints were structured was reasonably sensible. In all cases, customers had been involved in formulating those policies, and in some cases, customers were involved in actually analysing real complaints as well. Good range of systems, good levels of staff training. And although I haven't detailed them here, but there were some really nice nuggets actually of really good practice. I mean, for example, RHP had done some great work, I think, around engaging with their local authority, Richmond in London, where the local authority has a complaints, not SAR, but sort of person who oversees complaints. So some really nice elements of good practice. So as I said, on paper, certainly no shortage of guidance and good practice, all look good. But you can hear the but coming. When we actually looked, thankfully, when we looked at the reality of what people were actually receiving as the responses to their complaints, it wasn't so good, particularly in the written side of things. I think somebody said, I think it was in the session you did, Claire, that there's a real concern that any organisation might try and respond to a complaint without having a conversation with the person, or even trying to contact them to work out what people want. And I think that appears to be quite common practice. So very, very much emphasis on written responses, a lot of which was very, very stiff and formal, a lot of it based on standard templates rather than individual type of responses. And and I know this may seem like a subtle distinction. I got a real sense that, yeah, there's plenty of evidence here that organizations were handling complaints in terms of processing them, but very often it seemed to me they weren't actually really resolving them. So once again, what a surprise that you end up with such low satisfaction. People, if people feel they've received a complaint, their response, but it hasn't really demonstrated proper listening and response. And bit naughty of me to focus on it too much, but I just think the whole tone of how organizations were responding was sort of just trapped in negativity. So yeah, something's gone wrong. That's the reason a complaint has come in, but it just seemed that there was very little attempt to move thing on from there. So there was the one memorable letter we saw which used the word complaint 43 times. It was just like a sort of bell going off every time the word, and as a result it just seemed consumed by negativity, the response. So once again, no lack of policy or strategy, or I'm sure no lack of intent or determination on the part of organisations, all the colleagues involved in doing this to actually try and help. I think what there was a real absence of was actually in some cases basic customer service practice, but beyond that, just a real absence of human warmth and connection. It was just almost devoid sometimes of any sense that it was one person dealing with another. On the subject of which, we should mention, if we go on, Ellie, the role of the housing ombudsman here, because obviously one of the dominant influences on the way organisations deal with complaints in our sector is the Housing Complaints Code, which was what, 2020 that first was issued, and we've gone through two different versions since then. I looking at the complaints code, the original one or the one that was updated this year, I don't think there's anything unreasonable in it at all. It's all perfectly good stuff. But I think the problem with it is that it is so process oriented that it actually encourages organization to take this rather sort of cold, impersonal, process driven approach, and almost to the exclusion of thinking about the person behind that particular complaint. Just for, because it's the kind of thing that comes into my head, I did a word search in both the original and updated codes to look for words like people, feeling, compassion, empathy, anger, frustration, upset, any of the things that we all experience when we make a complaint, and none of those words appear in the Ombudsman's document. It is a very, very process focused document. Now, I raised that with the Ombudsman, and they said, well, yeah, but it's not our job to tell organizations to be nice and to be human, but I think the downside is that it does encourage organizations to forget those things, and as a result you end up in a situation where organizations become focused on compliance rather than actually thinking about, well, what is it we're trying to do here? Once again, an issue which came up in the session you ran yesterday, Claire.
Yeah, can I just interrupt there actually, Ian? Because at this point, Claire has actually said, I think the key is that the customer has accidentally become the ombudsman, which is, I think, and
yeah.
I'm inclined to agree. And
Yeah.
Nick has said the same thing. Ultimately, we're responding to the ombudsman rather than responding to the customer who's made the complaint.
No question. I've seen so many examples, and not just from the organisations in this project who were very open about sharing their stuff, but from other clients we've worked with, and I've said exactly that to them. It says, seems to me you're writing to the ombudsman here, and which is in itself is bonkers, because that's the last thing you want to do. I mean, your objective should be to have nothing to do with the housing ombudsman. You know, if you can't resolve your own customers' complaints, fine, that's what they're there for. But I mean, really, that's the last thing you want, is to be thinking about this is going to the ombudsman. So
you've got your hand you've got your hand up, Claire.
Yeah, I just slightly wanted to defend the housing ombudsman, because I agree that the complaint handling code is very process driven. But if you listen to what the housing ombudsman says and go beyond that to their thematic reports and the rest of it, I think they are very people focused. So I don't think people are considering the whole picture when they go into that process driven
Yeah,
way of
really, really
working.
good point. And once again, it's where, and I agree with you. I think some of that spotlight work they've done, and they've really shone the light on some important issues, damp and mold, windows, and so on recently. Problem is where is that being felt? That excellent work, and certainly I think until recently, it's been hard to see where that was actually impacting upon people's actual experience of complaints. So it may be reflecting in people's in strategies and policies, but is it being felt that last mile kind of experience of dealing with a complaint? Yeah, good point. I see there's a few other chats, so feel free to pick up.
Yeah.
I can't actually see what.
Nick's saying Richard Blakeway has been excellent driver of improvement. Oh, he has, absolutely.
Yeah.
I know that I've looked at other ombudsman sites just to see how they respond and the sort of findings that and actually the housing ombudsman is much more about the people than other sites. If you look at the financial ombudsman site, you'd be horrified with some of the determinations that they make, because they really don't consider the person as much as the ombudsman does. Nick says there's a very big difference between the housing ombudsman and the LGSCO in this local government. The local government. What's that? What's the acronym, Nick? Local government.
Local government and social care ombudsman,
That's
because
it.
they have responsibility for adults and children's services as well.
Yeah.
No,
Okay.
all fair points, and I'm not here to beat up the housing ombudsman, but I did want to highlight, I think, the very clear sign that the particular requirements of the code has caused, I think, a lot of organisations to go off down a particular direction with their complaints handling, and I'll amplify on it a little bit more in a moment. But no, all perfectly reasonable points, and I agree. There's much to be said for having a robust ombudsman when something clearly is. I mean, I've got a complaint going at the moment with the energy ombudsman about a British gas problem I had. So yeah, very important role. And generally speaking, I agree with you. I think they do say the right things. It's just the particular impact at the last. I don't like the word frontline, but at that sort of customer contact point of how that best practice has been interpreted. If you wanted to apply a bit of sort of management theory to it, I don't know if this is of any help or not. If we go on to the next slide. I expect some of you have come across this thing called, there's a McKinsey model, I think originally, the 7S model. So set 7 things beginning with S that dictate how an organization works. So strategy, structure, systems, skills, staff, style, and shared values. I remember the first time I saw this, which is some years ago, it was divided into what was called the cold triangle. So structure, strategy, and systems, the sort of processy stuff again, and then the warm square, skills, staff, style, and shared values, the people stuff again, if you want to sort of broadly line that with my policy. And I think my view of what's happening with complaints is that they've been, and it just happens to make a sort of a house shape, is they've sort of been shoved up into the cold of the loft, where it's all to do with whose responsibility is, what's our strategy, all that system stuff. And there's really not enough attention or priority being given to the warm stuff down in the house where the life is, where the humans are, of actually what skills are required, whether or not your staff have them. I'm sure they do. And indeed the intent, the style, as we've been saying, of response, and really at the end of the day, how it actually reflects your organization's values. I come back to this point about doing yourself justice. So I think my plea based on this project is that we need to get complaints. I mean, yes, you need strategy, structure, and systems. Of course you do, but we need to get it out of the loft and back into the house, into an area, into a more human space. So I don't know whether that slightly tortuous analogy is of any help at all, but I think that's pointing to where the priority should be. I just wanted to mention just 2 important influences on the work we did together with the housing association. So if we carry on, Ellie, rather. I think probably the pretty much universal experience, and if we think about our own experiences of customers, is when something goes wrong and you have to make a complaint, is that there's a strong psychological sense that you've been wronged in some way. Either you've been let down, you've been messed about, you've been misrepresented. That the emotional feeling, quite apart from the practical or the financial or anything else aspect, the emotional content of when something goes wrong is this, I think, this idea of feeling wronged. And as that picture indicates, I think that can be a very complicated, multi-dimensional kind of thing, sometimes competing things going on through our head. And my colleague Michelle, who's our behavioral psychologist, can talk much more about this than I will. But I think it's, unless we recognize, acknowledge, allow, and make it our business to deal with those emotional aspects, we're never going to get very high levels of satisfaction, because it's such a potent and important part of most people's experience when they feel any of those emotions. So once again, I think it's easy to overlook it from a kind of purely transactional point of view, that if you're just dealing with complaints as a kind of administrative process, the risk is you never go anywhere near those emotional elements, and as a result, you miss a huge part of what's actually going on for people. But as a kind of illustration of that, if we go on to the next slide, Ellie, some years ago, I came across, but once again, some of you have seen this or versions of it. I came across this ranking in the International Customer Service Survey about what matters to people as customers when something goes wrong. So this was based on a survey across loads of different countries, loads of different industries, and purported to have identified this pattern that when something goes wrong for us customers, there is a sort of a hierarchy of what is most important to us. So the thing that I think is really interesting about this ranking, and we referred to it a lot during the work together, is that fixing the problem itself of getting the product repaired or replaced or whatever it might be, that is number 7 out of 11 items. So it's actually below halfway. And I think if you look at the stuff that is above it, so speed, apology, treatment, acknowledgement, explanation, assurance, all of those things, the softer stuff, if you like, the more human stuff, if this ranking is to be believed, and I think it is important to examine our own experiences, that is more important to us than actually fixing the problem, or it's the essential run up to satisfaction with how the problem has been fixed. If you don't pay enough attention to those first 6 items and just focus, once again, in a very transactional way on the problem itself, once again, don't be surprised that your customers aren't very happy with you. And if you really neglect those first 6, then the risk is that you flip over number 7. So you may have fixed the problem, but actually you've still got people who are angry with you, want their money back, want to be compensated, or in really extreme cases, it will actually make life difficult for you. They will actually exact revenge from you. And as was said many times during this week's summit, a lot of customers don't have the choice not to consume your homes and services anymore. They're kind of very limited in their scope there, but they will exact revenge in other way, just by being, well, either the kind of aggression that was mentioned earlier on, or in some other kind of way by saying not good things about you. I think that's so fundamental. I reckon that list is probably one of the 3 or 4 most useful things I've ever seen in my career, actually, because it really forces you to stop and think, and it's counterintuitive, or it feels counterintuitive to start with. So I'd be interested to get any reactions to that, or if people have seen similar things before, or indeed how any of you actually do work with that in your approach at the moment.
I agree, Ian. There's some comments in the chat here. This is, and I've shared with you before as well, haven't I, that we use something similar in our training, our complaints training, because it's important to remember it's not about the compensation. And Claire's actually said that. She said, "I love this. I'm happy to see compensation is near the bottom," and that's my experience, certainly. And I don't know if anyone else agrees. Tell me if you agree. People generally start exacting revenge and wanting compensation when you annoy them during the process. Because what they first want when they make a complaint to you is for you to speed up and get things sorted. What they want. So she said, she says there's a huge myth about that. And people throw good money after bad. And Nick says he loves it. You've got your hand up, Nick. What were you wanting to say?
I think it's excellent. I'm very interested in the whole customer journey through these sorts of processes, and I've been working on something around sort of upstream feedback and downstream compliance as a concept. And this list in a sort of a sequential order, would it be fair to say that complaints as a process really starts around sort of between 7 and 8, and actually between 1 and 7 is more sort of customer service and customer feedback territory.
Or I'd go even further, basic humanity. I mean, that's the way we should be treating people, isn't it?
Civil behaviour. It's totally agree.
Antonia says, I'm surprised, and I was actually, but I think it goes back to what you're just saying here. I'm surprised that fixing the problem is at number 7, because their feedback suggests that customers just want the problem fixing. And yes, that's what I always say on training. What they want you to do is fix the problem. But you're right in what you're saying, Nick and Ian, that the first 6 are all about behaviour, aren't they? And then that's
How
where
you
the
do it,
complaints
isn't it?
process starts. You've got your hand up, Hannah.
Yeah, I just wonder if we think about it from an abstract perspective, we think, if something happened to me, so if my mobile phone broke, somebody said to me, what do you want from that process? I would want it to be fixed.
Yeah.
But actually if it was say if it was poor quality, or you wouldn't have expected it to have broken in the circumstances, then I think it's the absence of the apology and the acknowledgement. So I would be really interested to understand whether this survey was based on people that had been through a complaint recently, and so that's what shaped them, or if they were kind of thinking about it from a perspective of if you stood back not with that recent experience, because I think that's your gut feeling, isn't it? You just want the issue to be fixed. That's what you'd want from a complaint. But I think if I think about things that have annoyed me the most with various customer services, it's when people don't even acknowledge or apologize and say, I'm really sorry, that wasn't great. It's not, you're right, it's not about the compensation, but it is that acknowledgement is huge.
You are right, Hannah. I've just closed a stage 2 complaint with my housing provider to say, if you had at stage 1 shown me some empathy, compassion, and concern, it would not have escalated, but you didn't. And so you annoyed me, and so it escalated. Michelle's agreeing. She says, I think there is sometimes a rush to fix the perceived problem rather than take time to listen and acknowledge. I noticed you put your hand up, Sheila.
Yeah, it's a similar thing, really. I was just going to say the speed's an interesting one, because I think that sometimes we're actually too speedy because we assume what the problem is and what somebody wants. And actually, I think you need that whole acknowledgement. And actually, I think there's probably something for me missing there, which is about questioning, about being clear about what the actual complaint is. Because sometimes what people complain about isn't the underlying issue that they've got. So I think speed definitely from a keeping in touch with people. And I think that's the big thing that misses for me. And, having to close a complaint in 10 days, I think is absolute madness, because some complaints might need to go on for longer. But as long as it's getting properly dealt with, as long as there's communication with the customer, regular communication, and you feel that you're being listened to, and you actually feel that somebody understands, then actually you will allow things to take a bit longer to get the right result, rather than a quick result that's not quite right.
And I think that's where it sometimes goes wrong, because the people wish to close within 10 days. They create an action plan, and then after the 10 days, forget the action plan, and then it escalates to a stage 2. Kylie, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, hi. I think this is all very common sense and makes a whole heap of sense. And I think if we were all in the customer's shoes, this would be our expectation. My experience with managing teams who receive complaints is that often putting yourself in the customer's shoes can go out the window, where there is a perception from teams that they need to protect the organisation and not admit liability and not apologise, because if I apologise, it means that we've done something wrong and we need to pay compensation. And so I think therein lies the tension with the written documentation that says this is what we do when complaints are welcomed, etc., and we're all about continuous improvement, versus the implementation at the coalface, where individual people quite low on the hierarchy are the ones at the front line, and they're sort of thinking, oh, if I admit liability, is someone up the chain going to go, oh my God, that's just cost us all this money?
Yeah,
so
and
I think
that's a cultural.
It
culture,
is,
isn't
yeah.
it, Kylie?
Which gives us a brilliant springboard to move on to what should we do about it, because
Yeah.
we spent a bit of time there sort of analysing the problem and where we're at. But I mean, obviously, what's more important is how we're going to improve it. So
Yeah.
perhaps I should move us on. As I said, if I had to sum up the entire experience and learning, I think from the point is this real importance of being human. So, which includes the being open to people's emotions. We are very emotional social beings. So once again, I think one's response to complaints when something goes wrong needs to be rooted in that reality from both sides, actually, both what's going on for customers, but also to what extent you can draw upon colleagues and indeed organizations' values and skills to try and put things right. So, as I said, if you need a 3-word summary of what we've come out, is just be far more human. So, moving on, the 20 ways I mentioned, they kind of break down into 4 areas, really. There's some sort of overview things, which I think starts off with just addressing and facing whether you're doing well enough around this, through to the mindset, the thinking, and the attitudes that you bring to complaints, and a lot to do with empowerment, as we were just touching on there, Kylie, as you said. So I suppose you could bracket all those first three circles under the broad heading of culture. Really, it's the soft infrastructure that you're bringing to complaints, and then the remainder of the 20 points, and I'll run through a few in a minute, are to do with the actual practice, the way in which you actually execute that. And I think what that spread of different categories reminds me of is that getting this right is very much a composite thing. There's no single thing, apart from being human, possibly, no single thing that will deliver you excellent results around complaints. It's one of those areas of life where it's about getting lots of little things right consistently, and probably in some kind of order as well. So it's not like something you can just learn to do or flick a switch and you'll get it right. You won't. It's a constant composite skill of making your business to focus on lots of little things. So I'll just run through some highlights from each of those headings. So if we go on to the next slide. So under overview, I think it's about knowing where you stand. So what your current performance is, how your approach matches up to the best. So one of the things that's in the reports is what we call a ready reckoner. It's just 20 or so questions to ask yourself, and then you can give yourself a score as to where you stand in terms of best practice. So when you see the report, you may want to have a go at that, or ask a number of people across your organization to get an honest assessment of where you stand. And I think from an organizational point of view, you have to look at yourself in the mirror and say, well, are we content to carry on doing what we do at the moment with the results that we know we're getting, 34% satisfaction, or are we going to make it our business to improve and change this? And I think that's a fundamental choice we have. Yes, you have to comply completely with certain things, but I think there's a choice here between carrying on doing things we know don't work very well, or having the oomph to do it differently. If we go on to the next slide. And under mindset, I think is this absolutely fundamental point, that being reminded that every complaint is something incredibly unique and individual. So anything that attempts to respond to that in a standardized way, and I'll talk about templates briefly in a minute, really, I think, risks missing the point, and at a stroke makes it much more difficult to engage with those top 6 items on our list. If you're treating this as just a process where people are just numbers and you aren't paying enough attention to people's individual emotional aspects, particularly, there's a real risk that things won't go well. And while, as I said, I applaud everything that's written in the Ombudsman's Code, I don't think just complying is enough. If you really want to get this right, you have to go some way beyond compliance. So I liked your phrase earlier there about compliance is a downstream thing. It's what you do much earlier in the process that's really important. And a point that came up in the session you ran yesterday, Claire, is this. I mean, nowhere in the housing law, in the code of complaints, regulations, anywhere does it say that complaints need to be a formal thing. So just because something has gone wrong, where does this idea of, right, suddenly it's got to become very formal come from? The best way to respond to something going wrong is, as we all do in our relationships, is to be human about it and say, you're absolutely right, we've let you down there, or something's clearly gone wrong. What are we going to do about it together? That's a human response. So I think a lot of the dissatisfaction is created by that artificial and, in my view, completely unnecessary formality that suddenly erects the moment we have an expression of dissatisfaction. So I think it's about moving beyond very fixed mindsets into more innovative and being willing to grow, kind of, in terms of the way we bring to the way we think about complaints and how we respond to them. Next slide, Ellie. On the empowerment side, it really troubles me when this idea that if a customer makes a complaint, then from that point on, they have to remain sort of passive, silent partners until they receive their housing provider's decision in the form of an email or letter, what is. And it just seems to be missing a massive, obvious asset that this person has had the experience. They know what's gone wrong and how they feel about it. You know, you really need to be engaging that person as an equal, active partner in coming up with what your response. So this kind of very top-down approach to complaints, whereas yes, you've told us something wrong, we will issue you with a decision, like you're some kind of great oracle or judicial status, is very misguided. And above all, I'm sure in all of your organizations, and I very rarely meet an exception to this, I mean, all your people, the reason they work for you is because they're motivated to try and help. So now in them to use those motivations and their basic human skills is so important. And there was a lot of evidence in the work we did with residents is that just the simple fact of speaking to or visiting somebody who's made a complaint makes a massive difference to the eventual outcome. Now, I appreciate it's probably not going to be possible for reasons of geography or for anything else to visit everybody, but at least to think about, of all the complaints we've received this week or month, are there any in there that would really benefit from a more personal, hands-on, face-to-face approach? And if so, make it your business to do it. There's probably some that could be dealt with much more straightforwardly, but where it's screaming out sometimes for a bit of human contact, that does have a massive, massive difference. And then on the practice side, as I said, there's quite a few things in here. I mean, I think the things I would say is that when something goes wrong as a service provider, the way you communicate about it, that needs to be the very best communication that you think you're capable of. So yes, there will probably be some constraints around that in terms of what you're able to offer, but the way you communicate should be the absolute best that you're capable of. And as I said earlier on, until recently, very often it's been the actual opposite of that. It's been some of the worst communication. So I think, you know, really being able to look critically, support each other, look at each other's works, be open about sharing stuff. You know, is that the actual best communication we could possibly have given there? And for that reason, I don't know what, interested briefly in people's practice, I would only use templates with extreme caution and templated letters and emails, and indeed if you know that they're really, really well written. So somebody that receiving one, they probably won't even recognize it is a template. But a lot of the templates are almost, as somebody said earlier on, written like they're for the ombudsman, and they're really poorly written, and as a result they just wind people up, I think. So, you know, if someone's taken the time to complain to you, I think the least they deserve is an individual bespoke response, both face to face, on the phone, and in writing. And another little issue which crops up in the, I think as a result of the code, is this idea of upholding or not upholding someone's complaint. I think it creates an unfortunate, once again, unnecessary, certainly unhelpful knife edge where the whole thing rests on this one word: uphold, not uphold. So I think the advice from the project is that just try and stand back for a bit and think about everything you do in response to this complaint, your whole response. That's your decision, not just that one word, whether you uphold or not uphold. The person should be left in no doubt about whether you're taking it on board or not and what you're doing about it. But just try and, well, just make it easy for yourself as well. Don't trap yourself on this knife edge of saying whether you uphold it or not. If you need to make that, if you need to code it in some way for your own performance, fine. But I don't think that's what customers find helpful. And above all, don't just assume that because you've sent someone a response, that someone will be satisfied, or indeed that what you've said will happen. I mean, RHP were very honest about this. They said that they were being constantly let down by their contractors, or indeed even their in-house teams, that they said a certain repair would be done and then it wasn't. So once again, you're not going to have a very customer. So proactive personal follow-up after a complaint to say, you know, you made this complaint 2-3 weeks ago. How's it going? Has everything been fixed? How are you feeling? That is really, really important to close that loop. And then final point on practice. Unsurprisingly, I think all of the organisations that took part in the project said that an inordinate amount of their time gets taken up with a very small number of customers who make repeated complaints or complain about the same thing a number of times. And very often, unsurprisingly, there's some kind of mental health or other thing going on in that person's life that is driving that behavior. And I think, once again, it's really incumbent upon organizations to just realize that, think differently, think creatively, make reasonable adjustments and allowance for someone who might have a mental health issue that is driving that, and not, once again, just try and shove them down the same pipe of a complaint that someone else without those conditions might be making. It does require more thinking, so that at the end of it, you end up hopefully doing the right thing for that particular person in that particular situation, in that particular occasion. So you're not trying to, as I said, just sort of processify the whole thing, that you're making your solutions fit a standard set of known outcomes. And just to wrap up, I mean, I would say, however well you're doing this at the moment, even if you were getting 100% satisfaction on your complaints, what you're doing today will not be good enough in another 18 months or 2 years' time. I mean, we live in a very dynamic world where people's expectations are changing the whole time. Technology is changing. I mean, the impact of artificial intelligence is going to have a massive impact on all of our lives. So you need to keep on experimenting and improving. So the laboratory idea, if you like, is hopefully something that we can all carry with us. And as I said earlier on, just to make yourself be sure that you are doing yourself justice in the way you respond when things go wrong, both as an individual and as an organization. And if you get that right, next slide, hopefully you'll see some of these benefits in terms of actual, you can see that you're providing a better service, you're paying out less compensation, and indeed your people are enjoying their jobs more. And I think that it's feeding into some of the bad images and perceptions of social housing itself. Next slide. We are just still stitching together another group of housing organisations to take part in a second stage for this complaints lab, which will take it from where it is now. So it will take the work we did in the first stage, which I've just summarised, and say, right, well, where are we going with that? So we are still putting together another organisation, so a group of organisations, so that will hopefully kick off next month. So if anyone's interested in that, please get in touch. And then final slide. That's it, really. I mean, I hope that's given you a flavour of what we did. As I said, please have a look at the report. Let me know what you think of it. And once again, it's been interesting just judging people's expressions and reactions here. I mean, I don't think there's any lack of intent or determination to do this better. It's just how we grapple with some of these things. And I do think at root, it's very simple. It's about allowing ourselves to concentrate on the people, be human rather than the process.
I absolutely couldn't agree with you more, Ian, on that final point. Catherine's actually said in the chat, I certainly saw the issue about upheld and not upheld at my previous provider, actively tracking KPIs around how many complaints have not been upheld. It drives a culture trying to look for reasons not to uphold complaints rather than looking for solutions. So, you know, complaints should be all about looking for solutions. And what we say in our training is, you know, even when you decide that you're not upholding a complaint, you don't think there's a service fault, there's still something for you to learn from that. There's always some learning in a complaint, whether you have held it or not.
Once again, that word uphold, not uphold, that doesn't appear in the code, it doesn't appear in the regulation. It's just one of the things that's just crept in as a very simple shortcut, and I think it's really unhelpful and unnecessary as well. So everything that you say, do, express, give the perception of to your customer when something goes wrong, that's your decision. So how they feel at the end of it, that's how they'll interpret, not whether or not you've upheld or not upheld. Plus, frankly, who are we to uphold or not uphold?
Yeah.
We're just another party to this situation, aren't we? It's not for us to say whether it's upheld or not upheld.
Yeah, and as Maya Angelou would say, people forget what you did, people will forget what you said, but they will never forget the way that you make them feel. And I think that's a good place to end the session today, actually. And it just remains for me to say thank you for joining us today, Ian. Ian's got his contact details there. If you want to be part of the next lab that they're holding, please make a contact with Ian. Otherwise, if you're looking on my LinkedIn feed, I'll put it in the email that I sent through to you as well. We've got a 6 Thinking Hats training around complaints, different ways to think about resolving complaints, bringing new perspectives to the complaint handling process. We've got that training on the 25th of September. So I'll put that in the email that I send to you. Otherwise, thanks for joining us, guys. It's been an absolute pleasure to facilitate this. The next roundtable will be a surgery for you to bring your stage 1s and stage 2s to, so that we can talk about them and think about how you might move forward if you're stuck. Okay, so
Stay human, everyone.
good to see you all. Thanks, guys. Bye, everyone.
All right, thanks again.
Bye.